Welcome back. Once you've identified components in your app that are re-rendered unnecessarily, there are a few steps that you can take. Let's go back to our app. And we said that our header component is kind of re-rendering unnecessarily. I mean, this is a small example, but you can imagine if this was another part of the app that is really, really complicated, maybe we don't want that re-render every time we hit the search box. So what can we do? Well, first off, let's create a new header component. And this header component, again, we'll have to import React. And we're getting really good at creating React components because we've written them so many times, but that is always a good thing. And we want to make sure we export default the header component. And within here, we can just return or use the render. And inside of the render, we can just return what we had initially, which is just the simple h1. All right, nice and simple header. And if we go over here, we can just replace this now with the header component. And we'll want to import this from our components. Save everything. And once again, I want to add a little console.log here to see what's being rendered. So I save it here. Let's also add a few more. Let's add in the card list. We'll add a console.log that the card list is being rendered. And we want to make sure that this is a string. And let's add another one for the search box as well. Let's save. Go back to our app and let's go to console here. And because our logger from Redux is kind of crowding our console, let's just for now disable it. I'm going to go back to index.js. And for now, just remove this from our apply middleware. Let's save that and go back, and that's a lot better. All right. Now we see over here that they're being rendered twice. And if you think about it, why is that? Well, it's because initially the robots array is empty. And then we make that API call, the robots array gets filled, which is our state. And then we re-render header search box card list. So how can we avoid the re-rendering over here of header? Well, we have a lifecycle that we can use called should component update. And this comes with every single React component. So it's a React lifecycle hook. And it returns true. If it returns true, then it will update the component. If it returns false, then it won't update the component. This component actually receives next props, and next state. But for us, we don't really need that. We just know that we don't want to render the header component. And so we can just say return false. Let's see what happens here. I'm going to save, go back, and look at that. Our header component just renders once, the original time. And no matter what now, our header component will never re-render. And that is because we always have should component update false. Nope, just never update this component. And this is pretty dangerous because you're saying never ever update this. If this component actually received props or state and any of these change, it won't re-render because we've just said return false. The default right now, if we don't add should component update, is to always return true. But should component update gives us an ability to control this update cycle. Let me give you a better example with something a little bit more complicated than a simple text. Let's create a new file here, a new component, and we'll call this counter button.js. And once again, going through our motion, I'm actually just going to copy the header over here and change the names just to make things easier. So let's say counter button. And now this counter button is going to do a little bit more than just have the h1 tag. In the constructor, we're going to call super, and then here it's going to have its own state. And it's going to have a state that says the count is equal to 1. Or let's do count is equal to 0. That's the default count. And for now, let's just not do anything here. I'm just going to keep that empty, so it's always going to update the component. And then finally, within the render, let's render something meaningful. Let's render a button that, let's say, has a color property. And this color property is going to come from this.props.color, which we're going to pass on. And also a onClick event, update count. And this is going to be a method we're going to create. And this update count up here will be a simple function that simply updates our state. So this.setState is going to have count as this.state.count plus 1. Now we're going to get back to this, but for now, let's just have this button, the counter button, in the header, and also pass down the color props. And it looks like over here the highlighting is off, so I think we made a little mistake. Oh, and that's because I need to close off this button. Let's do that. And let's just put a piece of text in here that just says count this.state.count. All right, let's just save this and import this into the header. We're going to say import header, import counter button from the counter button file. And inside of here, we can return a div that has the counter button with, let's say, color of, let's do color red for now. And let's not forget to close the div. Let's save. And we have a few syntax errors here. If we go to header, well, yeah, I need forgot my bracket here. All right, let's go back to our app. We have our count 0. I don't really like where it is, so let's actually put it below the h1. Let's save that. That's a lot better. And if we click on it, we get some errors. Should component update returned undefined. And you're right, because we're calling within the counter button should component update, but not doing anything, it's not working. So let's just do return true for now. Go back and let's click count. All right, very cool. Looks like it's working, and we're rendering the count button. And the count number is increasing every time. Now, I mentioned over here that sometimes you can get some funny side effects when you update the state based on what the current state is. That is because state updates are actually not synchronous. That means they might not always happen when you might think. So anytime you're using state like this, or you need to derive the next state from the current state, it's recommended that you use the other way of updating state, which is to grab the current state and return the new state based on this state parameter. So let's save, go back, and it's still working. Perfect. Let's clear this. Now, just for fun, let's take a look at next props and next state. If I go over here and do console.log next props and console.log next state, let's save here, go back, and let's clear this, and I press count. I see that I get the next prop, red. Well, it's not going to change because we haven't changed any of the props, but the count is now 1. If I click again, count is 2, count is 3, and you can see we have access to both props and state. Now, what happens if for some reason the state doesn't change? Because we don't really care about anything else and our prop of color red is kind of static right now, in should component update, we can do something like this. We can say if this.state.count doesn't equal next state dot count, if they're different, in that case, well, yes, please return true and re-render. Otherwise, we can just return false. Let's save that. Go back. Make sure everything still works. Yeah, everything still works. But let's say that now we want to change our props. Let's remove or comment out the should component update from header and refresh here and type something in. We see that our header is updating once again. And if we go back to our counter button and in the render, we see that counter button, although we're console logging it, it's not appearing here. It's not re-rendering. But if I remove this piece of code, let's say we remove should component update, I save, and go back, we see that the counter button is now being re-rendered. And even though we don't touch it and don't care about it, because our parent component is being re-rendered, we also get re-rendered. So by adding should component update, only update if the state count changes, that's the only time that our component should update. Very cool. But now, no counter button. Now, there are times when you have simple, what we call dumb components or stateless components or presentational components, kind of like this card component here. It's a pure function and only changes when its props change. React has a special type of component built in called pure component that is meant exactly for this. So if this card component was kind of like this counter component, we can say extends pure component. And we can just import from React pure component. Now, what does this mean? This means that only the component from now on will only re-render when its props actually change. That's it. Nice and simple. If you change this card component to have a class with that extends pure component, it automatically does the should component update only change if these three things change, which is really, really nice. Now, the one caveat is that this pure component does something called shallow comparison of props. So if you use complex data structures like deeply nested objects, it may miss some props changes and not update your components. So I'm actually not a big fan of using pure components. I personally like using should component update, which does the same thing, but you have a bit of control. But you shouldn't overuse this because now you've added an extra step in your React update to check for something else. So this actually also has a performance penalty because you're running another function to check if anything has changed. Because should component update is a method that is called before render. This render right here. So use this cautiously. Never just add this because, oh, it's going to improve my performance. Actually measure it. If this helps for those rare cases, definitely use it. But don't overuse it for every single component, which I've seen in many projects. It could actually hinder your performance or sometimes miss some updates because of this shallow comparison that it does. I want to show you one last tool that might actually help you with some of this because it is a bit of a headache to figure all of this out on your own. It's called Why Did You Update? And why did you update? This is a tool that tells you in the console that, hey, why are you rendering this? Nothing has changed, but it's re-render. It's an avoidable re-render. So it does this for you, and all you need to do is implement it into your React app just with a few lines. And you make sure that it doesn't go into production. You just use it for development purposes only. Because one of the most common issues that affects performance in React is this unnecessary render cycles. Because remember, React components will re-render whenever their parent renders automatically, even if their props didn't change. So this tool allows you to run this in development and see if when you're doing any unnecessary rendering. And this is extremely useful when you have a large app where it's really hard for you to just do console log or figure out where the highlights are happening. But again, with everything, use it with caution. Use your time wisely because performance, you can always improve your app's performance. You just want to have this big picture and understand how your app works. In your case, how this React Redux app works and how you can improve it. By understanding all these small details of how it works, you can now make smart decisions on how or when to tackle your performance problems. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.